Can I ask you something?
What?
You know I like you, don't you?
Yes?
And I hope you like me the way I like you.
Yes?
I was wondering if you would be my girl.
Oh, Michael. It's beautiful.
Now it's official. I have something I want to tell you.
Yes, Michael?
I'm not like other guys.
Of course not. That's why I love you.
No, I mean I'm different.
What are you talking about? Are you all right?
I'm a net decker.
Hello, and welcome to a very spooky episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I am one of your hosts, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, eater of candy corn Maddox.
That's the voice you're going with?
It's a Halloween episode, Anthony.
It's the spookiest season of the spookiest year.
So spooky. It's a very spooky year. Everyone's dying of a horrible disease. Very spooky indeed. Does that trivialize the deaths from COVID-19 to do that?
You know, if no one else is going to take it seriously at this point, I feel a little bit nihilistic about it.
We're not going to go 2 weeks in a row talking about COVID-19 at the top of the show, Anthony. This is not a show where we get distracted by the bad things in life. This is a show where we get distracted by the good things in life. The best thing in life, Magic the Gathering.
Zombies. Oh, okay.
Zombies are fine too. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, this is Happy Halloween, Anthony. This is our Halloween week episode. I mentioned Candy Corn Eater because you like candy corn and you like to play a little candy corn nose game.
Oh, I forgot about that game.
Do you want to describe the nose game so all of our listeners can also play the candy corn nose game?
It's a very simple game. You just put a candy corn on your nose and then try and eat it without using your hands.
Yeah, you put a candy corn on your nose with your head tilted back. So you're like, you're looking upwards, balancing a candy corn on your nose, and you got to try and eat it without using your hands. It's a pretty fun game, I think.
Here's the special trick is the actual game is you just tell your friends to do this and laugh at all the funny things they do with their face.
Wait a minute, you've just been laughing at me all these years? This is not a real game? This was invented to shame and mock me?
Yep.
Oh well, what are you gonna do?
Sorry,
what are friends for, you know? If
gave up the goose on that one.
If not inventing games to shame and mock you. On this week's episode of the show, we are going to be answering a listener question that we got emailed to us, and I'm not sure we've said this very often. We've mentioned it before, but if you have a question about Cube or anything and you want to send it along, we will happily take questions and answer them on air. I think it's helpful to have some idea of what you out there listening want to hear about more, so do email us at mail@luckypaper.co if you have a question for us. We're going to answer a listener question. We are going to be talking a little bit about the recent updates I made to my own Cube. I finally got around to my Zendikar Rising updates, and it was a big batch of updates we made, so we'll be talking about that. Yeah, I don't know, seeing where that takes us, Anthony. We always like to follow the thread of conversation very naturally.
Let's just talk about magic.
Yeah, exactly. Just an excuse to talk about magic on a Saturday morning with your bud. But first, Anthony, we are going to do a Pack One, Pick One from a listener-submitted cube, as we do most weeks on the show. And this week, because it's so spooky out there, we are going to be doing a Pack One, Pick One, of course, from an Innistrad-themed cube. This particular Innistrad-themed cube comes to us from listener Steven. Thank you, Steven, for sending along your Innistrad-themed cube. And, Innistrad, of course, is Magic's spookiest, most gothic horror-themed set. And this particular cube is, I believe, all the planes of Innistrad, I think.
Yeah, so it's cool. It's actually got cards from all of the different sets that have taken place on Innistrad, and including even some cards from supplemental sets that sort of are themed with Innistrad. So I saw at least Gisa Ghoul Color, which is a favorite card of mine.
Right, from a Commander product.
Right, yeah.
I think this is a good place to mention. Some people out there are interested in making set cubes, I know, which is not something you or I have done. But if you are making set cubes, there is an incredible resource available to you called the Magic Multiverse Project, which I will link in the show notes. And this is a website that not only has a collection of lore and sort of descriptions of all the planes of the Magic universe, but importantly, it also has a crowdsourced list of all cards that reference a plane but are not printed in that set. So if there's some core card that has art or flavor text or something from a plane, it'll be listed on the page for that plane, regardless of what set it was printed in, which is a great way to find the core set cards that actually have Innistrad flavor or whatever if you're making an Innistrad themed cube. I'm going to read the pack as always. If you are playing along at home, you want to try and figure out what your pack one pick one is, you can pause after I'm done reading the pack and then hit restart again to see where the conversation picks up when Anthony will enlighten us with the picks that are in contention for his pack one pick one. So, the full pack is Curse of the Bloodletting, Lightning Axe, Compelling Deterrence, Advanced Stitchwing, Divine Reckoning, Laboratory Brute, Nahiri the Harbinger, Fiend of the Shadows, Skeletal Grimace, Wild Hunger, Macabre Waltz, Graph Harvest, Endless Ranks of the Dead, Diagraph Captain, and Rancid Rats. Lots of good Innistrad flavor in this pack, Anthony. So, what are the cards that are piquing your interest that you're looking at?
So the cards that I'm most interested in are, I think, Endless Ranks of the Dead, Fiend of the Shadows, Nahiri, and Advanced Stitchwing. I think those are the ones that really stand out as really peak power level in this pack.
So what about each of those cards is appealing to you?
So Nahiri, obviously, she's a planeswalker. I assume that she's good, because she's a planeswalker.
I didn't read the rules text, but, I saw that it was a planeswalker, so I'm going to take it highly.
No, yeah, but that's pretty much it. And I'll say, looking at this list, there is a fairly big power level delta. So, the difference in the most powerful and least powerful cards is fairly high, which I think is going to happen when you're constraining yourself to such a limited number of cards by restricting yourself to certain sets, which isn't all bad at all. But it does mean that something
captures a little bit of the flavor of a set like this because, obviously, retail Innistrad had a big power delta because it was a retail set, and this is a cube inspired by retail Innistrad, not meant to mimic it, but I think still having, that difference between, say, Nahiri the Harbinger and Wild Hunger or Laboratory Brute, I think is still appropriate and cool.
Right. So, Nahiri has basically a removal spell that'll then generate additional value, is going to just take over a lot of games. I'll also say it has a very special place in my heart, as I have a very distinct memory. This was, Shadows over Innistrad? It was one of the first sets that I actually did a full draft of, and I remember playing this card at the Crown at the Bun Magic Kitchen Table Pro Tour, which was
you got to draft Nahiri.
Yeah.
All I remember from that whole block is that you did manage was it our sealed league that you managed to actually assemble Brazella, which is...
It was absurd. It was actually even better than that because it was literally, we opened up a pack every week and it was the very last pack. And not only was it the very last pack, but it was a foil. But it was the second card. So I already had Gisela and I was like, oh my god, I'm brand new to Magic. I'm just giddy. What if I open the second half of this pair and get to assemble this ridiculous card? And I go to the rare, and I remember distinctly, a new Scraft Mob, and I was so disappointed. And then I realized there was a foil in the pack.
Oh, that's amazing. You assembling that Brazella on the dirty table at the Crown was really something. Have some
Unfortunately, I did open the pack at home, and there might have been some suspicion that maybe it wasn't legitimate, but I promise it was. I don't think I had even bought a single at that point.
You are not a man to cheat in a situation, to cheat in general. You're not a cheater.
Cheating at the friend draft? Why?
It makes no sense to cheat at the friend draft. It makes no sense. I mean, you could argue that there's some motivation to cheat at competitive Magic, but cheating at the friend draft. I mean, what are you doing? There's nothing on the line here.
Anyway, so what a delightful time at the Crown in another spooky season. The other cards, Fiend of the Shadows, I haven't actually played with, but it basically lets you steal cards from your opponent's deck, which, again, that's a very strong effect. I think that if your opponent doesn't have a lot of removal, this is a card that's just going to take over the game. Similarly, Endless Ranks of the Dead, the question I have with that is how narrow of a card that is. Is it more narrow to start with a gold card like Nahiri or something that just requires a lot of zombies? Just looking at this pack, it seems like there are a ton of zombies, so if the format's pretty slow and there's not a lot of enchantment removal, this is really a card that's going to take over the game.
And importantly, in Innistrad, in most sets, zombies are kind of completely constrained to black, but in Innistrad we get at least blue zombies, and I think maybe even a couple on other colors, but, blue-black ends up being kind of the zombie tribe in Innistrad.
And then Advanced Stitchwing is also a card that is a powerful threat that you can get back from your graveyard, sort of use extra lands in your hand. So I like that just as a pretty efficient recurable threat. I think, actually, I'm reading it again, Fiend of the Shadows seems like it's doing the same thing, but just has a higher ceiling. So maybe let's just go with those three.
Yeah, I think between Advanced Stitchwing and Fiend of the Shadows, I like Fiend a lot more. I overlap with you on two of those. I agree with Nahiri and Endless Ranks of the Dead being in contention. I have three other cards I'm also... Well, really two other cards, and then a little shout-out, a little honorable mention. I think Lightning Axe is a very high consideration here, too. This card is just good on value. Like, I think there's many decks in cubes that will happily play one mana removal spell that requires you to discard a card, even if they're not getting a lot of value off that discard. And this, of course, is Innistrad, so we have a lot of graveyard synergies, we have a lot of madness going on. I expect Lightning Axe to be about as premium removal spell as this cube has available to it. I also think that Divine Reckoning is interesting and worth considering. I don't know off the top of my head exactly how to break the symmetry on this, because it's a wrath, but you each get to keep one creature of your choosing. So obviously having big creatures seems good, and not having small creatures, that seems like it has a high ceiling to me. It has flashback too, so it can grind into the long game. So I think that's also worth looking at. And then my little shout out is just a Diagraph Captain. I think I think it would be somewhat reasonable to sit down and say you're going to force zombies, and even though you're probably never going to take Diagraph Captain over Endless Ranks of the Dead, I think Diagraph Captain is up there in terms of the most powerful cards in this pack, on the back of how good zombies are and all the things on that card in terms of rules text. So those are my sort of picks in contention. Really, I think for me it comes down to Lightning Axe or Nahiri, and I would take Nahiri. I mean, there's a lower density of Planeswalkers here than in a normal cube that runs a high density of Planeswalkers, and yeah, she's really good. I mean, again, also a discard outlet with all the madness stuff going on. Again, most cubes that play Nahiri don't really have conscious discard things going on, so she's even better here than in perhaps a regular vintage unpowered cube or whatever. And of course, the removal spell is very strong. So I'm going to take Nahiri. I'm not sure about you.
I think today I feel like Endless Ranks of the Dead is where I want to be. Maybe we'll wheel that Diagraph Captain.
Yeah, I think you are going to get plenty of zombies. I would not be worried about turning that on. This is an environment where there's not going to be a lot of rafts and board wipes, because really all you need is just the one or two. I guess you need two zombies to get it going, because it's half rounded down.
Just a zombie, right?
Let's see. X 2 zombies, where X is half the number of zombies you control rounded down. You need two to get it going.
You need two zombies.
Yeah. But once it's going, it is basically as inevitable a card as you're going to get in this environment, I imagine.
It's not quite as good as Liliana's Ultimate.
No, not quite, it turns out. Not quite. All right, that is our Pack 1 Pick 1. Thank you, Stephen, for sending it in. I appreciate having a appropriately spooky cube to do a Pack 1 Pick 1 from on this very spooky week. I'm taking Nahiri. Anthony's taking Endless Ranks of the Dead. We both agree they're very good cards. My second pick is Lightning Axe, though. I think Lightning Axe is spicy.
I think that's pretty reasonable.
If you would like to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, please send it to us via email at mail@luckypaper.co and include a link to the cube, a little description of it, and your pronouns and how you'd like to be credited so we can do it on the show. Especially if you have a Christmas-themed cube or a Hanukkah-themed cube or whatever, because those holidays are coming up. We're going to need some themed cubes to do there, and I feel like that's going to be a little less common than Halloween-themed cube,
I wonder if you could put together a Thanksgiving-themed cube.
You could definitely do that, I think, actually. I mean, we got birds, we got food, we got all kinds of... There's lots of things in Magic that reference, like, native people. I mean, problematically or not, you can kind of get a bunch of, warriors and archers and stuff in there and make that into something. I don't know. I feel like you could make it happen.
Guess how many Magic cards include the word thanks in their title?
3.
0.
Dang.
You were close.
I do that sometimes. I'll search for an English word just on Scryfall because I'm looking to like reference a card as a joke or something, or like, sometimes I'll try and like in one of our articles, I'll like, link to the card hover for on a word that's not a card as kind of like a little Easter egg. And it's funny sometimes, like certain English words, like the word thanks, you get literally no responses. And then other English words like, I don't know, like blood, you'll get like, 400 cards, or, Deterrence, I'm sure there's a couple cards, or like there's weird words that show up a bunch that other words that don't.
Words.
There's still a lot of space for magic. When are we going to the Christmas plane is what I want to know. I want to go to Christmas land.
God, Magical Christmas Land would be the best plane.
I would love to see them do that in Black Border. I know some people would get salty about it and feel like it wasn't high fantasy enough, but I think it'd be so cool if they did a like Christmas inspired, all of the various, holidays in the Christmas universe, all the Christmases in different cultures. It's got magic. It's a magical world. It just works.
True. What's more magical than Santa Claus?
Listener Adam writes in with the following question. Adam has a long email here. I'm going to pull the question out specifically. Adam says, I've been playing Magic for some time, but almost entirely just drafting or playing EDH. I have a smallish collection of EDH cards and draft chaff I've saved over the years, but no plans to return to paper Magic anytime soon. Creating a cube seems like a perfect fit for all of these cards. Editorial note, I know some friends that have made their first cube under quarantine because they have nothing else to do with their Magic cards, and I think it's a very cool thing to do, so all about that. Adam then says, I have an awkward stratification of power level, though I'm curious what to do about it. He says he has 1 to 2 of all shocks and fetches, 1x of all the war gods, war being War of the Spark, right?
Yeah, I think so.
What are the gods in War of the Spark? Oh, the Oketra and...
Right, yeah.
Yeah, got those. So 1x of all the war gods, 1x of all the flip planeswalkers, I assume the ones from Origins, a bunch of +1/+1 synergy cards, mostly multicolored, Sensei's Divining Top, Sylvan Library, etc. I don't have enough cards at that power level to make a cube like Andy's Bun Magic Cube, but I would want to play at a higher power level than Anthony's regular cube. How can I include these powerful cards I have without warping a format too far beyond what I'm willing to spend to flesh it out? I think that's a great question, Anthony.
So there's a couple different parts to this question. One is, obviously, yeah, like you said, it's great. Even though we can't actually play with our cubes in paper, it's a great time just to be able to really explore the depths of your collection and see what you can do with it. So the things that are actually being asked are, how does sort of this delta in power level affect a cube? And can you even build a cube with these different power level cards? And how is that actually going to affect gameplay?
So what do you think?
I think the answer is, yeah, of course you can do that. There are a lot of sort of knock-on effects to how the game's going to work if you have this delta in power level, but there's not anything that's stopping you from doing it. It's not actually going to break the game. The other aspect of it is I think that a lot of cards really will play differently than you expect, or, the context is really key. So one of the cards that was mentioned here is Sensei's Divining Top, and you might say just putting this into any random cube is a bad idea because it sort of has this stigma, this history of being an extremely powerful card that really breaks open certain archetypes. But if you don't actually have miracles or, a lot of ways to profit off manipulating the top of your library, it might actually not be as powerful as you think. So I think the answer is just go ahead, try it, and see if it works, see if it doesn't, and see if it's fun.
I would definitely second that. I would say that, especially for your first cube, I would really not sweat power level stuff, because we kind of mentioned this on our last episode, but I think the excitement of playing your cube for the first time is going to so overwhelm any feel bads from the variance of a sort of higher power level delta that it's not going to impugn the fun you're going to have. And having been active in the cube community, very active for a few years now, I've noticed a very high correlation between length of time cubing and or the frequency with which a person plays their cube and their tolerance for the kind of swingy plays that come from high power cards in a lower power environment. Basically, people that are new to cube don't care, rightfully so, because they're like, you know what, I don't care. I want to play these cards. I want to cast them and see what happens and draft them and put them in my deck. And sometimes you win a game off the back of a powerful card, which is fine. And basically, the more you've been cubing, you might, if you're like many other cube designers, find yourself drawn more and more to basically cutting down on that power level. And because basically, frankly, the shine of just drafting your own cube wears off. And you're like, I've played this card a bunch of times now, and now it no longer brings me joy just to cast it. I want to make sure that I am really maximizing skillful play and all that kind of stuff. But I would really not sweat it for this first version of your cube. But if there's any card that you're looking at and you're like, I really just want to play this, just play it. It doesn't matter what it is. Maybe with exceptions of Soul Ring or something, just because it's so free and so warping and doesn't really provide any interest. I'm not sure it'd be worth it to try that out. But really, anything beyond that, even conspiracies are totally broken. But if you want to play them, do it. Jam Sovereign's Realm in your cube and play with it a few times to see what it's like, because that's really the only way you're going to learn basically what your tolerance for that kind of variance is.
So I think the bigger effect is not just variance, but the kinds of decisions that you get to make during the draft and what the actual optimal strategy is. So it's not so much just that, sometimes you have Nahiri and that means you win the game because you have a more powerful game than your opponent who didn't get to draw their one powerful card. Like, that's a kind of, we all, well, a lot of us enjoy limited Magic, and that's part of it, and it's still fun. I think the bigger effect is just that it'll reduce the replayability of the draft a little bit, because the games will actually tend to revolve, and especially the draft will revolve around a smaller number of cards, because those are the cards which are really driving you to build your deck in a certain way or draft a certain way. And when you go into your 5th draft of the Cube and you open up one of those gods and you say, well, I just have to take Oketra now because the rest of this pack is nowhere near that power level, so I don't really get to make a decision. I just know I have to take this card again. It kind of eats into that replayability. But honestly, that's fine, because the first time you play the Cube, replayability is obviously not an issue the first time, so put it together, and then you might find after the 3rd draft you kind of want to reduce some of those cards, but maybe not.
Yeah, I would say too, I don't want to overstate any effect on replayability, because there's still so many different variables in a draft. The combination that the cards end up in a pack, the order they're opened in, whether a card was opened in pack 1 or pack 3, even in a cube that has a high power delta and is kind of quote unquote on rails, right? Let's say you had really defined archetypes and there was basically one +1/+1 counters deck and one aristocrats deck, and all these cards had internal synergies but didn't really work with other cards. Even in an environment like that, I don't think it's even close to solved, right? I don't think that you can even look at a list and say, well, here's the optimal way to draft this color pair and assume that's correct. You could be totally wrong, and I think you'll find that by drafting and playing it, there's actually tons of depth even to environments that are seemingly narrower. So yeah, I think basically Anthony and I agree that you should not sweat this at all and just play the cards you want to play is sort of big takeaway.
For sure.
I do want to dive in a little bit to the kinds of cards that Adam mentioned, and because I think that each of these does have a different impact on the environment. So first of all, just from a card evaluation standpoint, I think Shocks and Fetches are among the best, most powerful lands you can play, but I don't think that really good fixing is going to ever have a negative impact on a cube environment, basically. I think it's pretty much just going to make all the decks in the environment work better, and that's really only going to be a benefit to you. It's really not a matter of the quality of fixing you run as much as the quantity. So, if you have a 360 card cube and you put, as we recommended last week, 50-ish fixing lands in there, then whether those lands are really high quality, really low quality is not really going to help make certain decks draftable or worse. It's just going to basically change how good every deck can play and behave. Now, if you decide to run just 20 fixing lands, then that'll make it harder to draft 3-color decks or harder to draft, aggressive 2-color decks because you won't be able to get those 2 colors early. And if you want to run, we have friends that run 80 fixing lands in their 360 card cube. And if you do that, then it's a whole different world where now a lot of players don't even have to play basics and they can play, greed piles if that's really what you want to support. So I would not worry about the Shocks and Fetches at all. I'm not sure if you disagree with me, Anthony.
No, I totally agree. I mean, the fixing, more than anything, really scales to the rest of the power level of the environment. And that's even something that surprised me a little bit. When talking about other cubes in the past, have thought, it's not a great idea to put Shocks and Fetches in a pauper power level cube because it's just going to be always a first pick. But that doesn't actually turn out to be the case as much as I expected.
Yeah, and Fetches are usually first picks in powerful cubes, so you're not really any different. You're still
high picks, but the best proactive cards are still going to be powerful.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth mentioning. There's a lot of bias that goes into a draft pick that is not just related to how good is this card in my deck. I mean, most players are going to be biased by other things, like how good they know this card to be constructed, or honestly, if it's an expensive card, they might be like, oh, this card must be better than other cards because it's expensive. So I think that Fetches and to some lesser degree Shocks come along with some of that baggage, where some drafters might be like, some players might play with you and say well, this is silly to have a $70 Scalding Tarn in this cube next to whatever common, but really it's not. And that's just a funny bias that you have to ignore, or if you're affected by it, try and get over, because Fetches and Shocks are just going to make your cube play better, which I like a lot.
I even went so far as just to add specifically 3 Shocks to my cube that otherwise has pretty affordable fixing lands. And I did get that reaction a little bit where players are like, well, this is ridiculous. These colors are going to have access to such better fixing. But I just think those colors need it because they're trying to be more aggressive, and it hasn't. I think it's actually positively impacted the environment.
So don't sweat that. On Sensei's Divining Top, which you mentioned earlier, Anthony, so first of all, I've never seen anybody that ran a Miracle sub-theme in their cube. It's certainly possible, but most players I know really dislike the Miracle mechanic. And
it's not something that's super fun for a lot of players.
Yeah, well, certainly not. I mean, you could really go deep on the top deck manipulation to basically limit the RNG of playing miracle cards in a cube, but I've never seen anyone do that. But Sensei's Divining Top, I think, is very good at almost any power level, but I will say that, like Shocks and Fetchlands, kind of, Sensei's Divining Top is this, like, utility card, right? It's no one's ever going to lose the game because someone resolves Sensei's Divining Top, right? It will accrue value over the course of the game that may cause you to win, but it's not a huge bomb that immediately ends the game and feels terrible for your opponent. So when it comes to things like cantrips, card draw spells, card selection spells like Sensei's Divining Top, I'll even put Sylvan Library in this category. I don't think you need to be as worried about those as you are about other kinds of power outliers for similar reasons. It's going to make the decks that have these cards function a little smoother, but ultimately it's not going to be the win condition. It's not going to be how you kind of lost the game. So it has a big window for your opponent to outplay you or draw out of a thing to answer it or do something. It's not going to immediately flip the game on its head.
Yeah, smoothing out your draws, whether you're trying to get, Oko or a 5-mana 3/3, it scales pretty well, I think.
Most people I know that don't play Sensei's Divining Top don't do it because they think it makes the games much longer, which I honestly have never experienced. I hear people complain about this all the time, that like Sensei's Divining Top just drags games out. And I feel like I've never, when I've had it or my opponents have had it, like the decision of what order to put the cards in never takes longer than, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Like it's always pretty easy. Maybe like once in 20 times you activate top, you have to think for a minute. But yeah, that may be a reason you might think about it. And we should mention that too about the fetches. Like it does cause you to shuffle a bunch. Some people like to minimize that, but that's totally up to your taste. And I wouldn't worry about that on power level either.
Yeah, again, give it a try. If it turns out that it drags out games and that's not fun for you, it's easy to cut. So I think it's worth considering these War Gods and the +1/+1 synergy cards kind of in contrast to each other, because the War Gods are all just extremely powerful in a vacuum. They're hard to remove. They have a huge impact on the game. Oketra is really the one that stands out, because especially if you have a wide variety of power levels, you're likely just to have creatures, and just generating a bunch of tokens is going to take over a game. On the other hand, the synergy cards tend to be take a little bit more care and work to make certain synergy cards really supported in a cube. So what you might see happen is that if you're including both of these, you might have a lot of games where one player is trying very hard to optimize these sort of 1/1 counter synergy decks, and then their opponent just plays an Oketra and ends the game on the spot just by virtue of having that one card. So that's the other thing that you might want to consider, is if you actually want the synergies to be the thing that is the power, the optimal thing, so that you actually draw people into doing the thing that you think is fun. Having these sort of extremely powerful cards in a vacuum can take away from that. But I'm just going to underline again everything that we say with, we can't say for sure that's going to happen. The only way to really determine it is just by playtesting.
And I think this is an interesting comparison, specifically directly to cards like Sylvan Library, Sensei's Divining Top, and the Shocks and Fetchlands, which I include all of the Shocks and Fetchlands, Sensei's Divining Top, Sylvan Library, all in my cube, which Adam writes that he doesn't have the cards available to make a cube of my power level. But I don't include the War Gods because, frankly, I don't think they're anywhere near good enough for my cube. So here we're saying, Adam, don't worry about these Shocks and Fetchlands and the Sensei's Divining Top and the Sylvan Library, which are cards that I do include in my higher powered cube. But I actually think that the War Gods are the cards you should be thinking about, as Anthony is indicating here, because they can have a very outsized impact on the game, right? They were all huge bombs in normal draft, near unbeatable, basically, if you drew and could resolve them. And if your environment is closer to that kind of environment, then they could be similarly warping to the sort of metagame of your cube. Meanwhile, Sensei's Divining Top is not going to be an unbeatable bomb in any limited environment, right? It's going to give you a little bit of value, and that value really scales with the power level of the environment and doesn't ever completely, shut things off. So I think it's worth noting that I think the viability, I agree with everything Anthony said, first of all. I think he's very smart. I think we should have a podcast together. I think the viability of the War of the Spark Gods and how good they would be not directly dependent on the power level of all the other cards in the cube, right? So I don't think you have to say, well, if I'm running the War of the Spark Gods, I also have to have a Snapcaster Mage, and I have to have a Dark Confidant, and I have to have a Goblin Guide, and I need all these cards that are powerful symbols of the most powerful cubes that a lot of people are running. I think what you actually have to think about is just, what does my interaction look like? Because the reason that the War of the Spark Gods are not good enough in my environment is not because they are so much worse than other 5-drops, or, or because, all these other cards are just more powerful, and so they get kind of outshined. It's only because I run a lot of cheap counter magic and a lot of cheap removal. And even though these gods do tuck themselves, if you played 5 mana to play a god and I Doomblade it for 2 mana, and you draw the god again in 2 turns, and I have another cheap removal spell, every time I do this, you're just losing tempo and we're even on card advantage. And that's a really good way to lose a game of Magic, at least in my environment. So you could consciously craft an environment where you were entirely budget constrained. You're working with just commons or uncommons, but still make these War of the Spark gods a liability by including a bunch of counter magic and a bunch of cheap removal, most of which is cards that cost 10 cents and are printed at common or uncommon is most of the best removal we have access to. So the viability of those War of the Spark gods and whether they would be a problem in the environment is really just a question of the philosophy of your cube design, more so than your constraints in terms of budget and power level, which you allude to.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really valuable to remember that power level and price don't always correlate, and finding those cheap answers that actually just give structure to the environment is definitely possible.
Yeah, I guess I imagine maybe as Adam is looking at this and maybe looking at my cube list and saying in Andy's cube at 5 mana in these colors we have all these planeswalkers and these expensive cards that are better than these 5-drops, and you can't say better in a vacuum, but in my cube certainly I think the 5-drops I include are better than the War of the Spark gods would be. But that's actually not the comparison you should be drawing, because you could have all of those powerful 5-drops that I have in my cube, and if you were just to take out all of the cheap interaction and really cut aggro's viability, a lot of my 5-drops would now be worse than the gods, right? If you don't answer Oketra, you're going to lose that game of Magic, right? It snowballs much faster than any of the green planeswalkers at 5 mana, for example, and if you can't deal with it, it is a much bigger win condition. So if you just tweak, it's why cube design is so interesting and also so hard, because you want to just basically draw a comparison to another 5-drop or a similar card and try and use that as a scale to figure out if the card is appropriate. But you really can't. You have to look at the whole environment as a whole. So as we emphasize, it is really hard. If I were you and you like the War of the Spark gods, you mentioned them here, so I assume you do like them and are interested in playing those cards, I would just play them and see what happens. I think what Anthony said is true. You might find that there's a person that, cobbles together a cool synergy deck that maybe doesn't have a lot of interaction, but has a lot of internal synergy and is trying to build value engines to beat their opponent. And if they're trying to build a 3-card value engine that is entirely obviated by their opponent's single card, then that certainly makes drafting that, value engine sort of synergy deck much less appealing. And so you might find that, they are warping the environment. Or you might find that, you just go through your box of draft chaff and you pull out your Heartless Act and your Doomblade and your Syncopate and your Negate and your, I guess not Negate specifically in this example. You pull out your sort of cheap, commons that interact with big spells. Yeah, Essence Scatter. And you can actually make these gods the kind of thing that a drafter has to look at and say, all right, this is a calculated risk. I'm going to play this 5-mana card that doesn't do anything when it comes into play, although the black one actually does. Bantu's really cool. And then I'm building my deck with the expectation that I'm trying to resolve this spell, and that's part of what my deck strategy is all about. Instead of just saying, well, this card's obviously better than all the others, it doesn't matter what my opponent's doing, I'm just going to slam it and sort of move on from there.
Yeah, I wanted to give a special shout out to Bantu as well. That's definitely the one that I had the most fun playing with in War of the Spark, top decking that card and saying, well, I'm just going to sacrifice, these 2/1/1s that aren't doing anything and a couple lands and draw 5 cards. Was a ton of fun.
Shout out to Bantu, our favorite listener.
Yeah, and I will say also that my own cube is, as Adam mentioned, is fairly low power, and I enjoy it that way. But there are cards like Bantu I think would just be format warping for my cube specifically, the way I've really tried to hone it in. So I definitely see the appeal of just wanting to play in somewhere along that range.
You think Bantu would be better than Archfiend of Ifnir in your cube?
Yes, I think so.
I think so too. Just wanted to ask, was curious. Do you have any thoughts specifically about the flip planeswalkers, Anthony?
So who do we have there? We have JVP. The rest. I think
the two you see in most unpowered cube lists are Jace Vryn's Prodigy and Kythian. And then Nissa and Chandra and Liliana are kind of, I think, a little bit, maybe a tier below in power level. Not surprisingly because they're more expensive. Basically, as cards get cheaper. Cards getting more expensive in mana cost is one of the things that will very quickly make them trail off in value in a very high-powered environment because of the presence of all that cheap interaction I just mentioned, right? You can play your Kythian before they have a chance to counter it, and if they remove it, then you're at least even on mana. I guess they could gut-shot it, but they're probably not doing that. If they remove it, you're probably even on mana or up on mana, which means you're pretty happy. Once you get to 3 mana, now you're running into, 1 and 2 mana removal spells pretty easily, and, cheap removal that can, and counter magic that can just kind of put you at a big tempo loss. So I think in the most powerful environments, that's why you see Kythian and Jace, because they're 1 and 2 CMC respectively. Liliana, Nissa, and Chandra, I believe, are all 3 CMC, and but are still very potent, I think.
Yeah, I think even in a slower, more mid-rangey cube, Liliana might actually be one of the more powerful in this cycle.
Yeah, like if you were drafting Origins Limited and you opened up a god tier booster pack that had like Kythian and Liliana, you're gonna take Liliana for sure.
Right. It's much easier to flip in a limited environment.
Much easier to flip, and also
tokens.
Kythian loses a lot of value if you're not being super aggressive. And
right.
I mean, that format did have Token Free Blades, so maybe you do take Kythian and then just take Token Free Blades over everything. Ooh. But in general, like the reason Kythian is good in aggressive cubes is because of high power level cubes is because of the presence of very aggressive decks, and he is a very efficient body that has all this additional value in the sort of mid and late game, which makes him very valuable. But yeah, in your environment, for example, for what you're sort of presenting here, Adam, you might find that actually Kythian is not even good enough to run, or maybe you just stick with Liliana and find that Liliana is better than Kythian is.
Context is everything.
Context really is everything, Anthony. It's true. It makes it. I think it's one of the reasons why Cube is difficult to talk about, because it's not very sticky, right? It's not very compelling to have to answer every question with, well, context is everything.
It depends. Do a lot of playtesting.
Yeah, it depends. Think about it really hard and do a lot of playtesting. It's much more evocative to just say like, this card's garbage, it's trash, and this other card's incredible and a staple forever. But you won't hear Anthony and I ever saying those things, because I think it's disingenuous to what Magic is and the sort of spirit of Cube. And there's a lot of people I think that pursue that power optimized Cube and like to talk about it as if that's all Cube and say things like, well, we don't run these cards in our Cube, or this card's a staple in Cube. But that's just not why we like the format. The format is interesting because of the variety it can present. And so the answer to most of our questions is going to be context matters. But we've been talking about this for 20 minutes. So obviously there's a lot to sort of think about and discuss regardless. So anyway, I think the Flip Planeswalkers are totally fine. If you don't like Planeswalkers as a card type, or you think they'll contribute to games you're not going to be a fan of, then that's a consideration. But I really like the design of those cards, that they are on their front half. On their front half, all of them except really for Kythian is overcosted, right? You're not super happy to play them for just the front half. They would be below rate, even in most limited environments. And then the back half is obviously a Planeswalker, which is great, but they ask you to jump through some hoop, which I'm always excited to play any card that will basically change the way that you both draft your deck, but more importantly, like sequence your plays. Like if you look at a hand and, well, obviously I'm just going to curve out, that's all this hand ever wants to do, that's not as exciting to me as a hand where you're like, well, the optimal play is to play in this order, in a vacuum. But if I play this way, which is otherwise suboptimal, I can potentially trigger this card or flip this card over, and that can be a lot of value for me. It creates a lot of interesting decisions and like risk-reward analysis of, does my opponent have this removal spell? Can they deal with the Planeswalker? Is it worth losing this tempo to try and flip something? And so I really like that.
Something else this brings to mind for me is that Adam specifically mentions a couple of cycles of cards. And that's something a lot of Cube designers want to do, is say, well, we have this cycle from a limited set. Cycle meaning a set of cards across colors usually that function in a similar way. And what you might actually find is that even though it's very nice aesthetically to sort of take that cycle and implant it into your cube wholesale, these cards are not all the same power level, especially when we're talking about the power level in different specific contexts. So one of the sad and hard truths is that you might find that you end up wanting to play only half of this cycle, and breaking it can be sad, but
yeah, if memory serves, I think Chandra specifically is especially hard to flip. Let me look her up, the flip Chandra. Chandra Fire of Kaladesh is 1 RR for a 2/2, so yeah, not great. And when you cast a red spell, you can untap her, and she taps to deal 1 damage to a player, just a player, and then she only flips if she has dealt 3 damage to a player this turn. So you either have to
cast 2 red spells in a turn,
or attack with her, deal 2, cast a red spell afterwards, untap, deal the 3rd is the other way to flip her. I think you're actually much more likely to flip her that way, but
Well, but attacking with a 3-mana 2/2 can be hard.
Right, exactly. It's still going to present some challenges. Yeah. So you might find that Chandra just, isn't cutting it and Liliana's overpowered and you decide to run just the other three. I think there are good reasons to run cycles of cards. I think some play groups might expect it and they might feel like they got tricked or something if they saw 2 cards in a cycle and not the rest. But in general, I would say that people should not put undue pressure on the idea of running full cycles. And I find it very liberating to just play whatever cards they want out of whatever cycles and just break things. I have like 3 talismans and 2 signets in my cube, and some people look at it and their eyes start switching out of their skull. But it's the right balance for me, I think. So yeah. I would also encourage you to be willing to break cycles where appropriate.
The aesthetics are not nothing. We shouldn't dismiss that. If you enjoy having a cycle there because it just satisfies you, then that's completely legitimate. But for gameplay reasons, yeah, they can have those issues.
Yeah, I mean, on the highest level, we all play Cube to be satisfied. And so if that's what you like, if you just want to open packs and see all the full cycles of those cards, then go for it. That's what Cube's all about.
Do you think the Flipwalkers includes Nicol Bolas the Ravager?
I doubt it does, but it could. This person has one of all the war gods and said they got most of their cards from drafting, so maybe they have a Nicol Bolas sitting around.
Pretty cool card.
I like that one. That's the kind of card I would like to play in lower powered environments where it is reasonable to force yourself into 3 colors to cast a card like that. I want those kind of payoffs. You should play that in your cube, Anthony. That's on the same power level as like Kess, right?
It's true. I feel like I would have to take Kess out, though.
Yeah, you probably don't want 2 full Grixis cards, I imagine.
Nah.
All right, the last point here, Anthony, is just, I'm curious to know, you said a little bit about how, a +1/+1 synergy theme would make for a deck that behaved in a certain way, right? You're trying to draft different pieces and, build this puzzle to get this sort of value over time. What overall do you think of the idea of a +1/+1 archetype in a cube like this?
I think it's great. I mean, something that I don't know how much we've talked about this, but a lot of cube designers will approach designing a cube and say, well, we have all these different color pairs, and let's figure out a specific sort of archetype or strategy that each of those archetypes should sort of, that should be their strategy, which is how a lot of limited sets are designed. The problem with that is similar to the other replayability issues we talked about, is you can end up with a sort of on-rails draft experience where it's just like every card fits into a specific strategy and only that one strategy. So you just sit down at the table and hope, blue-red spells is open or Simic counters is open. And, you get some level of quality of that deck, but you're not really making decisions beyond, is there a card for my specific archetype in this pack? The thing about +1/+1 counters is they can do so many different things that I think it's a really great strategy or synergy to have, because you can include a little bit of it in different colors and that actually are trying to do different things with those counters. So you can have a lot of cards that fit into not every strategy, but into a lot of strategies, which opens up a lot more flexibility in the draft where you're deciding between, well, this is something that's maybe, the best, most powerful card, but this is something that just contributes a little bit to the sort of synergistic strategies that I have in my deck. So I really enjoy +1/+1 counters just being a very open-ended and flexible mechanic.
I think you got at a very important point, which is that I have found that when new cube designers do have an archetype they're trying to build around for whatever reason, they will often, go to Scryfall or whatever and search for all the cards that mention +1/+1 counters. And that's a really good place to start, right? That gives you kind of all of the very overt, very obvious cards that might be interesting to run in your sort of cube. But many of these strategies or mechanics, especially +1/+1 counters, have a lot of other relevance outside of just cards that say, take a counter off this card, do something, or, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. So running cards that are just, small creatures that have first strike or double strike or lifelink or flying, little abilities that putting the +1/+1 counter on makes a big effect. Or, there are some cards that have 0 power that when they have a +1/+1 counter on them become entirely different cards that behave completely differently. So looking at cards that care about the power and toughness of creatures, looking at cards that care about doing something else with counters that don't care about what type of counter it is. You can find other cards that basically would help let this archetype bleed into other things that your cube is doing without having it be so self-contained and just be all about cards that say put a counter on a creature or creatures that care about having counters put on them.
I should backpedal a little bit and also say that this sort of idea of having different archetypes and different color pairs isn't necessarily a completely negative thing. I think it's especially just helpful if you're struggling to design a cube. Just having some kind of template to help you make some initial choices can be really, really helpful. And that's honestly where I started with my own cube. And then after, even before playtesting, but especially after doing some playtesting, trying to emphasize blurring those lines and spreading different strategies across more colors, just to give you as much flexibility in the draft as possible, is where I ended up. But it can be a great starting point to give you a lot of guidance.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess really reading this email over again, like Adam didn't even say that he liked these cards he listed here. He was just basically listing some cards he has and wondered if they might sort of fit together. So I think the question to ask yourself, Adam, is like, do you like playing with +1/+1 counters? I gather from your email that maybe you had a +1/+1 counter EDH deck because you mentioned you play draft in EDH and you have a bunch of multicolored +1/+1 synergy cards. So maybe you were playing, what was that Abzan guy with all the counters?
Guru of Spores.
Yeah, that one. Maybe you had a Gave deck or something you took apart. So really, it's a question of if you want to do it, if you like it, right? And to go back to what we said first, just to kind of close out this conversation with the same thing we said up top, do whatever you're interested in. And if you want to play a card, I would not be discouraged by a potential power level delta or too much synergy or too many gold cards or whatever. Just put all the cards you want to play in there, and you're going to have a lot of fun the first time you get to draft this, whenever that is. I know we're all stuck at home and unable to play in paper, which is a big bummer, but you're going to have a lot of fun drafting it, and that will kind of overshadow any of these sort of small things you decide to change in the future if you decide to do that. But if you're not excited about it, don't feel like you're at all obligated to play cards just because you have them, right? Or play cards just because you think they're good, right? Like you might be sitting here listening to us and saying like, well, you have this great set of, fetches and shocklands. If you just don't want to shuffle, don't play your fetches and shocklands, It's not going to bring you joy.
Shuffling is weirdly one of my least favorite parts of Magic and also one of my favorite parts of Magic.
It depends. I mostly really like it, but I have one EDH deck that I have to shuffle too much and it drives me crazy. Because here's what it is. It's a big deck. I like shuffling a 40-card deck. I don't like shuffling a 100-card deck.
Ooh, but if you can do the little accordion shuffle, it could be so much fun.
I can't really do that with my decks double-sleeved and perfect cards. They get pretty big.
Yeah, it's a little
excessive.
That's a big deck.
I only have myself to blame for that, so can't complain. Thank you for emailing us question, Adam. I hope some of the babbling over the last 30 minutes was useful to you and enlightening. We would love to get other questions from listeners, so if you're out there listening and you have a question about your cube or Magic in general or something we've said, please don't hesitate to email it to mail@luckypaper.co. And like Adam did, let us know who you want to be credited and what your pronouns are so we can answer it on the air.
Thanks, Adam.
Thadam. I want to talk briefly about the big update I managed to make to my cube. I was putting it off for a long time because, again, I'm not playing in paper, so why bother updating my cube list? But I was a guest recently on Jonathan Brostoff's Cube stream, JBro on Twitch. He was basically going to look at my cube and report to his listeners and me how he would basically analyze the cube to draft it. So the sort of context for this is that I was listening to Chateau Cube, one of our peer podcasts in the cube world, where John from Cultic Cube interviewed JBro and was talking about JBro's for those of you who don't know who Jonathan Brostoff is, he's a Cube Twitch streamer and a politician in Milwaukee who has a lot of success playing the Magic Online cubes. So whenever there's a cube on Magic Online, there's a little leaderboard of the people that have gotten 3-0s the most, trophies, what they call them. And JBro almost always is number one on that list by the time the cube is off MTGO. So grinds a lot of cube on Magic Online, has certainly played a lot more cube than either of us have, Anthony, and has a lot of success with it. And so he was basically talking to John on Cultic Cube about how he analyzes a cube before he's going to draft it, right? Like what he does to try and inform himself and like get his bearings about the environment before that first draft. And he graciously offered to do that for my cube on air as a means of sort of starting a conversation about it. So because of that, I had to get my updates in. I ended up sort of swapping out 27 cards, mostly for cards in Zendikar Rising, and a couple other things that were kind of lagging and just sort of sitting on my desk I meant to put in there a long time ago. You mentioned when I posted these updates that you thought it was weird to see me running some of the same cards you're running. What were you referring to there?
I just meant weird in terms of like, ooh, well, if you're including Maze Mind Tome and my cube is, objectively at a much, much lower power level, is it a mistake for me to be including it? And I think that, again, going back to all the things about power level scaling in different ways, I don't think it is actually a problem, but it does sort of make me take a second look at things.
I think Maze Mind Tome is a great example of a card like Sensei's Divining Top that I think is going to scale very well with the power level of the environment and never going to be completely overpowered, probably. I mean, I guess like in a really, really slow environment, Maze Mind Tome could have an outsized impact on the game, but really it's just going to scale, I think, with whatever you're doing and works nicely in that way.
Same with Curator of Mysteries, and admittedly I think these are some of the more powerful cards in my cube, and Fairy Guide Mother was another one that stood out to me.
Curator of Mysteries is interesting because I think in your cube, I assume that I want to be casting the Curator side of Curator of Mysteries like upwards of 80% of the time. Like I look at it in your cube as like, this is a 4/4 flyer with this sort of discard synergy that if I'm really stuck on lands, I can cycle away if I have to, right? If I'm not going to get my third land drop, which is great, right? I love that sort of variability. In my cube, I expect maybe to cast it 40% of the time, 50% of the time, maybe. I think in my cube, I'm much more likely to be cycling it away than I am casting it because, the cycle scales with the environment, right? Like cycling 1 is how good is the rest of your deck? How powerful, how potent is it? And, divide that, add it all up and divide it by the number of cards left. And that's the value of drawing a card. And the value of a 4/4 with flying is a fixed value, pretty much, right? Like that is still somewhat context dependent, but we both start with 20 life. Creatures are the same across different environments. And so like in your cube, which I think the board is going to be less threatening and scary in your environment. And so playing a 4/4 with flying is better. Your removal is a little more expensive, so it's better for that reason. In my cube, if you're totally flooded, you'll play a 4/4 for 4 instead of another land, certainly, or instead of just drawing anything. But I think very often you're going to be cycling it to draw into, a counterspell you need or try and find that wrath you need so aggro doesn't, run you over, where just playing a 4/4 that dies to Flame Slash would not really help. So I think it's interesting that, like, I think the card is good in both environments, but for kind of entirely different reasons. I mean, obviously it's modal in both places, but I think the sort of leaning on those modes will actually be very different. And in my cube, I even actually list it under the instance for 1 blue mana instead of under creatures for that reason.
So would you say that context is important?
Yeah, I would say context is important, Anthony. That's kind of becoming a theme.
Although you say that you can't have scary board states in my cube, but I saw you this week make some pretty scary board states.
That deck was really fun. That was one of my favorite decks I've ever drafted from your cube. And in my great history of not really understanding your cube and not doing super well in it, I drafted the deck and I was like, oh boy, this really kind of went off the rails. I felt like my colors weren't open at all. This deck's not very good. But it ended up being quite potent. But yeah, I had a lot of fun with. Basically, I just love Bulbous the Citadel so much, Anthony. I think it's exactly the right power level for your cube too. Like it is. 6 mana is a lot. You have to still have a lot of life to throw by the time you cast it. So it's like it asks a lot of you, but then the payoff is really there. Like that, the card advantage is a sparse resource in your environment, and so getting to play 6 or 7 cards in one turn is a big advantage.
And Citadel and Maze Mind Tome together is extremely powerful.
I did combine Citadel and Maze Mind Tome multiple times, and it felt dirty. It was good.
The best thing, so we did a draft of my cube, and the best part of it was, I think people just had a good time. And that's when I feel like I'm doing something right in my cube.
Yeah, exactly. Again, like, we can get bogged down in all these conversations about, like, trying to balance our cube so there's, like, only minimal losses to variance and minimal losses to mana screw and all these kinds of things. But all of those goals are all in service of the idea of people sitting down and playing Magic and having a big smile on their face. And so if you find that you're achieving that people are having a big smile on their face and enjoying playing Magic, and you're doing something that is completely off the wall and whatever, like that's all that matters, right? At the end of the day, you just want to have a good time.
And I think a great thing in service of having a good time is you also cut Oko.
I did cut Oko. We talked about it on the show a while ago, and I committed basically when we recorded that episode 6 or 7 episodes back that I was going to cut Oko whenever I made my next set of updates. And so Oko is gone. I think, I mentioned in my sort of update blog post that I am fine cutting it because I think it was causing too many feel bads and a little too powerful. But also more importantly, like when I first put Uro in my cube, I was like, this card's pretty good, but not amazing. And the more I've played with Uro, the more I'm convinced that it's one of the best gold cards in my cube. And so the fact that I still have a really, really good gold card to pull you into Simic makes pulling that Band-Aid of Oko off even easier. Because that's what I want gold cards to be, is like, it's, pick 2 or even pick 1, and I have a good enough reason to commit to something powerful. And I think we've talked on the show before about how when you're at my power level, there are very few gold cards that are that much better than a monocolored card in either of its colors that are worth really going out of your way to take. And so that's why I was excited to put Oko in my cube, and I'm fine cutting him because I think Uro fills that slot exactly as effectively.
So do you try and have a gold card in each color pair?
I don't, because I don't think many of them are there, right? Like, I have a couple of guilds. Like, I have no gold cards in Selesnya. I have just like removal and stuff in Golgari, which I'd rather not have, but that's kind of where I'm at with that right now. And nothing in Boros if you don't count Figure of Destiny, which I don't because it's hybrid. So yeah, there's some color pairs, but I just don't think there is anything that sort of meets that bar I just described, and so I don't put anything in there because I don't think it's worth it. But I would love to have one gold card or two gold cards in each guild that was that powerful. It was powerful enough to be worth splashing or be worth pulling you into that color pair.
All right, Wizards, your challenge of the week is make a Selesnya card that appeals to Andy. You have definitely made enough that appeal to me.
Selesnya is tough because both green and white have so many incredible mid-range threats. Like, the mid-range threats I run in my cube are just like, choose 8 across these two colors to run of the 20 that are all incredible, right? And so not only does it have to be a gold card that is better than all of those, but it also has to be like enough better than those that it's worth not just playing an additional white, mid-range threat. They just both have so many good planeswalkers and good beefy creatures with enter the battlefield abilities, and yeah. I actually think that the pig from Zendikar Rising, whose name I can't remember, the Selesnya pig, is pretty close. It's basically a 4-mana 4/4 Mold Drifter without flying, which I think is pretty good, but it's just not good enough to be worth a gold slot, I don't think, for me at least.
Yeah, I'm surprised you even regard it that highly.
No, I think it's better than most people. Like, it came in much lower on our survey than I expected it to. I think it's probably the best mid-range threat Selesnya card, maybe. Like, it's up there with like Tristani and Tolsimir.
Friend to Wolves.
Thank you for knowing card names. I'm very grateful to have you on the show.
I think between the two of us, we get most of the ones we're trying to think about.
We do. It's good to have two brains. We'll get there eventually. You mentioned also briefly Fairy Guidemother, which I want to touch on because that also, I think, is indicative of something else I feel like I've been striving for with my cube that I think I've just achieved in white, which is that I love aggro. People that listen to the show regularly know that I really love fast, ruthless aggro decks. For all that I love aggro, though, I don't want to just include a bunch of Savannah Lions, right? Or a bunch of Jackal Pups in white and red, because I don't like parasitism, right? Like, I don't like having cards in the cube that only go in one deck and basically need to be drafted in a critical mass to be relevant. A single Savannah Lions is no good in a random blue-white deck. You need a bunch of them for that to be a sort of viable strategy. And to some degree, that's always going to be true of cheap creatures, but I'm happy to say that as of right now, I would say I have 0 or maybe half of a, like, quote-unquote Savannah Lion left in my cube. And the one to have, I think, is Sky Marcher Aspirant, which is the 2/1 that gets flying if you get the City's Blessing. Besides that, I really think all the other 1-drops I'm running in white are perfectly serviceable in some other strategy, whether it's a like slightly slower 2-color aggro deck, or it's a mid-range deck that plays a lower curve, or Thraben Inspector you can play in control or something, Giant Killer you can play in control. I think I'm getting closer. Legion's Landing you can play in control sometimes. I think it gets there occasionally. So all of these cards, I think, are, my goal would be that, like, I have a density of 1-drops for the aggro deck, but those cards are also serviceable elsewhere so that I'm not totally limiting and narrowing the sort of available draft picks. And I think Fairy Guidemother is incredible in aggro. I have compared it to basically getting 2 activations of Elspeth Knight Errant for just 3 mana all in the same turn, because if you play the adventure and then cast the card, then you jump something, increase its power by 2, and you got a 1/1 all for 3 mana, which is really relevant. And I found that evasion has been very important to my aggro decks to sort of fight mid-range specifically, because they can eventually play some good ground blockers and you'll be stuck getting through on the ground. And that's where being able to jump something in the late game is very, very relevant.
Basically, 2 mana destroy target planeswalker.
Yeah, I mean, jumping things is great against planeswalkers too. It's great with equipment. If you've got your cool equipment you have to hit your opponent with, you can do that. I also think that Fairy Guidemother, like a 1/1 flyer for 1, is not a very good card in most environments, including my cube, but because it comes attached to this card that also has late game relevance, if you really have to play it on turn 1 because it's your only 1-drop, it's not the worst because it also carries, a GT or whatever really well because it flies. So yeah, I'm really high on that card, and I feel good about where my 1-drops are in white right now, in that I think I have enough to support a very fast, very competitive aggro deck, but I also don't think I have overwhelmed my cube with a bunch of redundancy and parasitism in that sort of color. So these cards actually are relevant outside of it, and it adds more depth to the draft. My red is not quite there yet, to be honest. We have not gotten as many red 1-drops that are as efficient and interesting and do things in other decks, but that's a road I'm on, and I'm pretty happy that white's there now.
I was going to push back and say, even though Fairy Godmother is definitely more mechanically interesting, it seems just as parasitic, but I think you've convinced me.
Because it's also, in your green-white mid-range deck, depending on the matchup, you'll be really happy to have a thing that jumps a creature and, punches somebody. So
the next question I have then is, if you're saying these cards are now more flexible and more playable, not in every strategy, but still in multiple strategies, does that mean you just need an even higher density of aggressive cards, since the aggressive player isn't going to be rewarded by getting all of them?
I did actually add more with this change. I think I added 2 more red or white 1-drops as I cut Mardu Will Reaper. I added 3-Bit Inspector, Fairy Godmother, and Judge's Familiar, all to the sort of white 1-drop slot. So I went pretty deep, and for that exact reason, I was thinking if these are actually flexible, then and someone else is going to take 3-Bit Inspector for their blue-white control deck, then I need a few more to make sure that for the person that is drafting aggro, they can still get the density they need.
Asked and answered.
One last thing on my cube changes, which I think Anthony will also be happy to. I think Anthony will also celebrate. I have cut some cards that I think are very iconic to powerful cubes that I felt like I did not need anymore. Specifically, I cut Armageddon, Hymn to Turok, and Nether Void. Nether Void not being quite as iconic because of its weird status and expensive reserve list old printings, but basically being a black Armageddon most of the time. These are cards which I was excited to include in my cube at first because I really like playing rude decks that deny their opponents resources and have some symmetrical card that once they get ahead just kind of locks the game down. But I found that for a while I felt like they were necessary. I felt like my aggro decks didn't have enough reach, didn't have enough flexibility to win certain matchups if they couldn't have the chance of denying their opponent all their resources at a certain point. And I feel like at this point, the white deck especially does not need that anymore. And so I'm happy to cut Armageddon because it's the kind of card that, in certain matchups, it's kind of a liability. There's oftentimes not really a window against mid-range, for example, where you're really happy to cast your Armageddon as your white aggro deck. Against control, it's really, really strong. So oftentimes the game kind of revolves around, do they have Armageddon? Do I have to hold up a counterspell and respect the Armageddon for the rest of the game? Because if I'll lose if they resolve it. And I just feel like it's not necessary anymore. So I've cut that. I was really sad to cut Hymn to Turok only because I was using the Wolf Moon art as the sort of art for my cube on Cube Cobra, and I have to not do it anymore now because it's not in the cube anymore. But same sort of reasoning on Hymn to Turok. It was a sort of a card that would just draw you into a dedicated black deck, mostly black aggro, and now, because there's enough good black aggro cards in Zendikar Rising, I needed room, and I don't think we need that kind of card that can make you just discard all your lands on turn 2 or whatever.
I'm a little bit disappointed that you cut especially Armageddon just because it negates a lot of the equity that I had when you were complaining about Cosmotronic Wave, and I wanted to just say, well, this is just Armageddon, but at common.
It is a very different Armageddon. I mean, those are play patterns that come up in any cube, right? You're alluding to me getting totally bodied by Cosmotronic Wave in your cube over the weekend or over this week. It's not to say that cutting a card like Armageddon means I'm eliminating the possibility that people can get blown out by a card in my cube and feel real bad about it. It's still going to happen sometimes, but it was just that's kind of what the card was designed to do, and I don't think I need it anymore. I don't think it's necessary for the deck. So, like the dinosaurs, goes Armageddon from my cube.
I'm not too sad to see it go. It's like you said, extremely swingy, and even worse than losing to it is the times when you draw it and it's just not doing what you need.
Right, which is not zero. There's a lot of times where you just can't cast your Armageddon and then you're down a card, and you could probably show mathematically in the long run that you'd rather have Armageddon in your deck because it wins you 70% of the games and 30% of the time is uncastable, but just not the kind of gameplay I want to encourage. So out it goes. All right, should we wrap it up there, Anthony?
I think that was enough.
That was enough of our very spooky week of Lucky Paper Radio.
Spooky week.
Everybody, be responsible on Halloween and don't make it a super spreader event. That's all we ask here at Lucky Paper Radio.
Stay home and carve a pumpkin.
Eat some candy.
Play
Just
the candy corn
Stay
game
home
on
and dress
video
really
chat.
slutty and eat some candy. You can do that from the comfort of your own home.
Hey, don't shame people.
I'm not shaming. You're the one that assumes there's some negative association with being slutty. Slutty's great. I love being
wow,
a
that
slut.
backfired.
Yeah. You
I
got
apologize.
woke owned,
apologize.
son.
I apologize.
All right, this has been Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. Give him a Google, listen to his tunes, and send us your questions so you can be just like Adam. You can mail those questions to mail@luckypaper.co. Same place you send your cubes if you want us to do a pack one, pick one of your cube on the show. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Anthony, for talking about magic with me.
Of course. I just want to do a quick check-in, as we do every week here on Andy and Anthony. We'll be on Drive to Work. Were we on Drive to Work this week?
No, we have not. I'm looking at the list of Drive to Work podcasts in my feed, and no, I don't see us as a guest.
All right, well, we'll check in next week.